The minute Link stepped through the door, he knew something was different about this room. Though the door was still there when he glanced behind him, he couldn't see the wall it was attached to. There didn't seem to be any ceiling either. By all normal definitions, this wasn't even a room. A cold mist obscured his surroundings, so maybe this was just a big room and he couldn't see the walls through the mist. But his footsteps didn't echo like they had in every other room in this temple. His feet slapped on a thin layer of water on the ground, sending ripples in every direction. But the mist seemed to swallow up every sound, making the air feel close and vigilant. The only thing he could see with any sort of clarity was a single barren tree directly in front of him. He wasn't sure if it was dead or just dormant for the winter, like every other tree in this part of Hyrule. The gentle ripples from his footsteps as he warily approached it lapped up onto the gray sand about its roots. Gripping his sword tightly, Link circled the tree, peering into every knot and crevice of its wrinkled bark. He'd been through enough temples and dungeons by now that he knew even seemingly innocuous, inanimate objects could leap to attack him at any moment. Sometimes he still woke with a start from dreams of the Armoses in Dodongo's cavern, crowding around him and spinning madly. But after circling all the way around the tree, and even poking it cautiously with his sword, nothing happened. Link resolutely turned his back on it and walked several paces away, then whipped around with his sword at the ready, but still nothing sprang into life and attacked him. With a shrug, Link continued to walk in the opposite direction from the door he'd come through. They were bound to run into a wall sometime, right? After a few minutes of walking, he felt his skin prickle, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. Above the sound of his footsteps, he thought he heard another set of footsteps behind him. He whirled around, but there was nothing there. He paused, looking around warily, but nothing stirred other than Navi fluttering around his head. She would have warned him if anything was following him anyway. He was getting too paranoid, spending too much time in temples. Next thing he knew, he'd be trying to attack his own shadow. Trying to shake off the feeling that someone was watching him, Link kept marching forward. He strained his eyes, trying to see something through all this mist, but the only thing that met his gaze was more of this blank gray expanse. Gradually, he realized the mist was actually getting thicker, beginning to obscure even the tip of his sword that he held protectively in front of him. But did that mean he was getting closer to the solution to this room? Or was he just headed towards a bottomless pit? Navi bobbed in front of him. "I think I see the door," she said. He could just see her tiny glowing arm pointing in front of him. Link squinted, but the mist still obscured his vision completely. "Where?" "It's this way." He furrowed his brow, looking closer at Navi. Something in her voice was off. It was like she had a cold or something, but fairies didn't get sick. Then, from what seemed a great distance behind him, he heard a shrill voice cry, "Watch out!" After all this time, heeding her warning was as natural to him as breathing. Before he even stopped to wonder what was going on, or where the danger was, he was spinning away, bringing up his shield. A blade sliced across his side, drawing a deep gash along his ribs, but it missed his heart. As he whirled to face his attacker, he caught the sight of Navi. The blue fairy suddenly turned black and disappeared into a puff of smoke. That wasn't Navi. But he had to push that mystery aside, because he found himself face to face with himself. It was like looking in a dim mirror. The man before him and his face, his tunic, his hat, even his sword and shield. But everything was pitch black. All his clothes were black, his hair was the color of ashes, and his blade was as dark and shiny as if it was a shard of obsidian. The only spots of color were his eyes, which glowed an eerie red. Link held up his shield and warily circled around the strange being, who mirrored his actions exactly. "Who are you?" Link demanded. The other smiled, his lips parting to reveal sharp, shiny teeth. "Who are you?" His voice sounded just like Link's. "Are you saying you're me?" "I'm your shadow," the being said, seamlessly matching Link's movements as he switched directions. "I am what you could have been, had you dared. I'm all the thoughts in the back of your head you pretended not to think. I am who you really are." That makes no sense, Link said flatly, but he couldn't help a shudder run through him at the words of this dark version of himself. Go ahead, Dark Link taunted, still grinning. Deny me. Pretend you don't hear the truth in every word. But one day soon, you will accept me with open arms. Link stabbed at him, but Dark Link met his sword perfectly. For a minute or two, they traded blows, meeting each attack perfectly, as if they had practiced beforehand. Panting, Link backed away, eyeing his opponent more warily now. He had never met his match with the swordplay before. Not that he had many opponents to face another swordsman. Most of the monsters he fought were 10 times his size, or just didn't have the reflexes or skill to match him, like Stalfos. But this wasn't Stalfos. Something told him defeating this enemy would take every ounce of strength and resourcefulness he had. Slowly, he sheathed his sword, carefully protecting himself with his shield while he pulled out a dried bomb flower from his pouch. In a quick motion, he bit off the stem and tossed the bomb at Dark Link, but it seemed that his alter ego was expecting this, and simply raised his shield. The bomb bounced off his shiny black surface and exploded on the ground in a spray of water. He tried everything against this enemy. Everything! He even managed to pull out his bow and arrow and shoot at point-blank range. But all he got for his troubles was a slice across his bicep that made his whole right arm ache. Dark Link didn't seem to have any of the same items or gadgets that Link hoarded in the pouches and loops of his magically enhanced belt, but he could predict every single attack Link attempted. Link was beginning to tire. Not only was he losing blood, he'd be trudging and swimming through the cold water in this temple for hours before reaching this room. He couldn't fight this being much longer. He, the hero of time, was going to lose. And judging by the cruel grin on Dark Link's face, they both knew it. Get him, Link! He only had a moment to take in the situation. A glass jar zoomed towards him, surrounded by Navi's blue glow. The blue glow came from within the jar, which flew straight at Dark Link's face. It collided with a crash of breaking glass, and Dark Link grazed his hands with a cry of surprise and pain. Link took advantage of this momentary opening and stabbed him in the stomach. Dark Link staggered backwards as black blood poured from his wound and fell with a hiss into the water. A hole suddenly appeared in thin air behind him, a portal to complete darkness. Dark Link fell through the portal, which immediately closed behind him, but Link barely spared it a glance. Navi! Slinging his sword and shield back over his shoulder, Link dropped to his knees by the broken shards of the glass. Half floating in the shallow water, limp and still, was Navi. Her glow was flickering and dimming, and Link saw to his horror that a silvery blue liquid clouded the water around her. Gingerly, he cupped his hands around her and lifted her from the water. Navi? The water trickled through his fingers, which were soon covered with her bluish blood. Her wings twitched in response to his voice, accompanied by the faintest tinkle of acknowledgement. Trying to move as quickly and gently as he could, Link yanked his hat off his head and wrapped it around her tiny body. When she was safely cocooned in the cloth, he carefully tucked her in the inside pocket of his tunic, close to his chest. Just hang on, he whispered. With a twist of the green gem hanging from his neck, the world spun around him in a sickening blur. When everything finally settled down around him, he stood right above the submerged entrance to the temple, pulling the breathing cloth up over his mouth and nose. Link dove into the icy cold and swam as fast as he could out of the temple. Once outside, he kicked as hard as he could against the bottom of the lake and swam upwards. Never before had the lake seemed so deep, not even when he first dived down to enter the temple. The blue tunic the Zora had given him had been woven with a spell to keep him warm, and the breathing cloth meant he had no trouble breathing underwater, so he hadn't actually enjoyed swimming in this lake until now. But now he carried his dying best friend. Finally, Link's head broke the surface. He yanked the breathing cloth down and pulled out his ocarina. The frigid air stung his wet cheeks, making his teeth chatter so he could barely get the notes out. But after 2 tries, he managed to get through the minuet of woods, and the world faded around him. By the time the swirl of leaves and warm forest air settled on the dais in front of the forest temple, Link was already sprinting down the hill. He paid no attention to the sudden change in temperature, ignored all the soothingly familiar scents of the forest around him. Thankfully, all the evil monsters had fled since Saria rose to her position as sage of the forest, so nothing impeded him as he tore through the underbrush and impatiently batted tree branches aside. After what felt like far too much time, he found the ring of trees surrounded a small pool of water, like stone columns circling an ancient monument. A cluster of red fairies flitted around the spring, dancing happily through the air as the dappled sunlight sparkled on the clear water. As soon as Link crashed into the clearing, however, they turned towards him with a chorus of tinkles, like someone dropping tiny glasses in surprise. The fairies clustered around him, their wings batting against his skin as they examined his cuts and bruises. Their small voices tissed and tutted as they all cried things like, "Oh, you're hurt!" and "Let me heal that for you!" "Wait!" Link gasped, before they could expend any of their magic. "Forget me, please! You have to help her!" He pulled out the bundle of cloth that was Navi, unwrapping it with the trembling fingers as he tried to catch his breath. A dozen little gasps and sympathetic murmurs fluttered around him as he pulled back the last fold of his hat and revealing Navi's tiny, broken form. To his alarm, her glow was so faint he could actually see the outline of her whole body, rather than the usual ball of blue light that accompanied him everywhere. "Bring her to the water," one of the fairies piped up. "Every fairy is born from a fountain. We draw our strength from the water in these magical places." Link did as he was told, gently lowering Navi into the fountain. She floated in the water, her tiny face bobbing above the gentle ripples that disturbed the surface of the pool. With nothing better to do than grip his hat and wait anxiously, Link knelt at the water's side and watched. The red fairies began to spin around Navi, weaving around each other in a complex dance that rose to the heavens and then dipped back down to the water with a splash that sprinkled droplets of liquid diamond onto Navi's face. Glowing red particles rained down from the spinning fairies, but when they touched Navi, they turned blue, adding to her glow. Soon Navi's light was almost as strong as usual, but her wings switched weakly in the water. Following the fairies' directions, Link plucked a large leaf from a nearby tree and carefully fished Navi out on it, setting her safely down on a nest of moss between the roots of the tree closest to the water. "Navi?" he whispered. "She just needs to rest now," the fairy said, now swirling around him. He could feel their minuscule hands brushing against his side and arm, closing the wounds and easing his aches and pains. "Soon she'll recover her strength." "Thank you," Link said, watching the fairies drift wearily back to the fountain one by one. They had used up so much of their own strength they were beginning to flicker too. Soon they all seemed to settle on the grass or the water to rest. As he let out a deep sigh of relief, Link suddenly realized he was shivering. He was still dripping wet, and even though the forest was warmer than LadyCallian, he was probably going to catch a cold if he wasn't careful. So even though he wanted nothing but to fall asleep right away, he dug his green tunic out of his pack and changed, draping his wet clothes over branches to dry in the sun. Once he made sure all his weapons were within reach, and he wrapped himself up in his blanket, Link flopped onto the grass next to Navi. "Hey," she said, her voice faint and weak, but it was there. Tucking his pack under his head like a pillow, Link rolled to face her and grinned. "Hey yourself." "You did great. You defeated him. Easily." "Not that easily. I couldn't have done it without you. Speaking of which, how'd you end up in that jar?" "He tricked me." He could hear the petulance in her voice, despite how weak it was. "There was all that fog, and I got turned around, so I thought I was following you. But then he trapped me in a jar." "Yeah, he tried to trick me too." Link stretched a finger out to her. Her glow was strong enough now that he couldn't see it, but he could feel her tiny arms wrap around it. "He was trying to get my guard down so he could attack from behind." "How did you know which one was real?" Link grinned. "Are you kidding? You've yelled at me so many times I know your voice anywhere." A sharp pinch made him jerk his hand back. "I do not," Navi said, almost as indignant as usual. "I'm just inform you of what you need to know." With a chuckle, Link rolled onto his back and let his weary eyes close. "Good night, silly." "Good night, stupid."